You are listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. Join us as we have meaningful conversations that will help us discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word. For more information and additional resources, please visit readingfortheglory.com. This episode is brought to you by Beeson Divinity School. Beeson is an evangelical seminary at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, that offers a robust Master of Divinity program, forming students in person through a community-oriented model of theological education. Thanks to a generous gift, Beeson is now offering new full tuition scholarships for the 2025-2026 academic year, making its flagship and div program more affordable than ever. These full tuition scholarships cover the cost of tuition and fees for 3 years, which is the average time it takes to finish the MDiv program. These scholarships won't last long, so for more information and to apply, please visit beesondivinity.com or click the link in today's show notes. Welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast. I'm your host, Zach Kendrick. I serve as the executive director here at Reading for the Glory. We have another great conversation coming your way today, and I am delighted to be joined by returning guest, Karen Swallow Pryor. Karen is a writer and a speaker, and she has a monthly column for the Religion News Service. And her writing has appeared in various publications such as Christianity Today, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Think Christian, and the Gospel Coalition. She's also an award-winning author for books such as On Reading Well, Fierce Convictions, and The Evangelical Imagination. And her most recent book, by Brazos Press, is called You Are Called, Finding Your Vocation in the True, Good, and Beautiful. So we're glad to have her on today. Welcome back to the Reading for the Glory podcast, Karen.
It's great to be back, Zach.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you today. We had you on last year for our first run of the podcast, and I have to say that was one of my most favorite conversations because we talked about your book, The Evangelical Imagination. And we did 20-something episodes last year for our podcast. And that is easily one of the top 2 or 3 conversations I had the whole time we did that podcast last year. So thank you for that book. It was so helpful to me. And I know it was helpful to many as well. So thank you for that. I'm glad to have you back on today.
Thank you. That's encouraging. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, your book today is on calling. And as I told you before we hit record, I feel like it might be a little bit of a therapy session. Some of the questions I'm going to ask you today may or may not be for my own personal understanding, which is good. But I hope many people have enjoyed this book. And I know it'll be a blessing to many as well when they get a copy of it. And I hope this conversation does as well. Well, before we jump into the conversation, I was intrigued in your book. You talked about getting hit by a bus. Would you be willing, before we dive into the conversation about your book, to share that experience? Obviously, you did okay with it because you're still here.
I'm still here,
But
yeah.
you never hear about people getting hit by a bus and living about it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it was 6 years ago now. I was visiting in another city where I was walking to a meeting, and I stepped into a crosswalk and didn't see the bus until it hit me.
ooh,
It was obviously a very traumatic experience. I was out of town. My husband had to rush to get to me, and driving 8 hours was faster than getting a flight. I spent 8 days in Vanderbilt University Medical Center, had a number of fractures and broken bones and collapsed lungs and so forth, and came home 8 days later in a medic van where I recovered for the next 3 months before I was able to walk again. And then, of course, there's ongoing, lingering issues. But overall, I mean, I'm just very thankful that I survived and is doing mostly well. So
that's great. Yeah, I think that was before I got familiar with your work and ministry. But yeah, it's an amazing story. It's something I guess you can tell as a testimony as
Yes.
you did in your book.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, not many
Mhm,
people can tell about
mhm.
that kind of story.
And I didn't know until afterward, that I mean, of course, obviously, we have the saying that, I feel like I got hit by a bus because that's happened to people and it feels really bad, but I also did not know until afterward that apparently that city and another city in Tennessee hold, the highest records in the nation for pedestrian bus accidents, and there are a number of factors for that. I don't know them all, but some of it has to do with infrastructure and pedestrian no right of way for pedestrians, which is different from my own state. So it was just kind of a confluence of of variables, I guess, that just brought about this event.
Well, as we transition to the topic of your book, um, one thing that I think about, the topic of calling, and why did you think it was? Well, first off, let's start here, and then I'll ask that question. Let's just start basic. What is a calling?
That's a really good and important question. And of course, I'm writing this book and speaking about this topic as a Christian. This podcast is obviously a Christian ministry. And so I have to start there because if we back up and we just think about God's sovereignty and the way that he creates us all and creates the world and works things according to his purpose, then calling is part of that. So if our first calling as believers is the call to follow Christ, that actually is a calling. However, whatever doctrinal or theological term you want to use for that, there are different ones, but we are called to Christ and we obey that calling or we don't. And God is the caller. So he calls us in that way, but he also calls us to other things in life, other roles in life that are that play out the way he sovereignly ordained us to be born in a certain time or place, right? So just simply being born in the 20th century means that there are things he might call me to that would not have been the callings of people who lived, centuries ago. So all of those things that God orchestrates um, are part of our calling. Now, how specific we get from there is part of the rest of this conversation, but just simply understanding that there's a God who created us with a purpose and intention, and fulfilling that purpose and intention is the call he has on us. And then within that larger call, we have many other callings.
That's a great way to put it. Why did you think the Lord, for no pun intended, was calling you to write this book? And why was this topic on your heart at this time? Because you've written about different subjects, and it's related to other books you've written. But why did you think this was important now? And why was this topic on your heart at this time?
Well, the answer to that question is actually a really good sort of literal and simple um, example of being called. This book grew out of a talk that I was asked to give at a conference, at a small conference on the calling in the creative life. So someone literally called me or emailed me or whatever and asked me to do a talk on this topic, and I fulfilled that calling. I answered the call, I did it, and as I did, the response was so positive, and I began to give the talk in other places and be asked to give the talk more, and I realized, "Oh, this needs to be a book." And so it started with a literal call from a person, an organization that wanted me to address this topic, and it went from there. And then, of course, because I have decades of experience in counseling college students and talking to them and advising and mentoring and drawing on my own experience and experience with many other, ages of people who are in different stations in life who are my friends or, part of the audiences I speak to, I had much already to draw on in this topic. So I had experience and expertise and insights to bring, but it all started with that one request to do this thing that I did, and it grew from there.
Well, thank you for answering that calling and the calling to write the book. I know, like I said at the top, that this has been an ongoing subject in my own life, and I know for many. And it's interesting because it connects to the book you wrote previously, the evangelical imagination. At least in my imagination, because in the evangelical subculture, at least in America, the idea of calling, at least when I was growing up, was specifically reserved for someone who wanted to be a preacher or someone who wanted to be a missionary. That was the context of calling. That was the evangelical imagination of my upbringing. And just to get a little personal for me, that's when I felt called to the Lord to serve Him, not just to salvation, but to serve Him. That was the vein that I went down. Of okay, if I feel led to serve the Lord, called to serve the Lord, it's got to be as a missionary or as a pastor. Is calling in your understanding of calling, is it something that everyone has, or is it just reserved for a few? I think you touched on that earlier. And then another aspect of that question is calling something that you get as a young person, and then if you miss it, that's it? Or is it something that you can experience later in life?
Mhm.
I know it's a lot there, but
Yeah, no, there's a lot there, but I'll try to touch on each thing. Yes, absolutely. The American evangelical movement has sort of diluted or hijacked the term by using it in a particular context. And that may not have been the intention. I mean, there is a way in which we talk about being called to ministry, called to missions, but those are not the only callings. The other part that's sort of wrapped up in that is the idea that if you are a Christian and you are in full-time ministry, that is your full-time work, when in fact all Christians are in full-time ministry, whether they do it well or not, right? So, but there's that idea embedded in it. It means who gives you your paycheck, that means you're in full-time ministry. No, that is not what it means. So what you describe, I think, is something that is very common. Maybe it's less common now. I hope it is, and I hope my book helps contribute to that. So there's that that truncated version of calling for the Christian, that it must be this ministry orientation, and otherwise you don't have a calling. That's absolutely not true. As I already talked about, there are many callings, and the calling to the Lord is one. The calling actually to be a parent or a child or a sister or brother, those are things that human decisions and God's sovereignty bring about. We don't choose to be born. We don't choose to be born to the parents and into the family that we're born into. So being a member of a family is a calling. It's something that God calls us to, and many of us have to navigate that in different ways. So that's a calling. There could be a calling to, calling can be related to our work. And I do in the book kind of talk about how many of these terms have different definitions, and they're all definitions, but we use them in different contexts. We often use the word calling, and that's really the point of the book, to talk about our work and our vocation. And that's not the only use of the word, but it is one that we do need to think about. And again, I one of the main arguments of the book is that calling comes from outside of ourselves. And so therefore, if we are called, that means someone has called us. Now, we believe that someone is a capital S someone, but he uses, small s someones to call us. And that doesn't mean that there's only one calling, or that we completely miss it if we make a mistake. And it doesn't mean that people, through their sinful natures and fallenness, can't sort of be an obstruction to perhaps what God's call was for us. But it's not an all or nothing thing. And it's also, I want to make sure that I bring this point up. And so I don't know where it would fit best, but I talk about this in the book. It's also not the erroneous teaching that God has a perfect plan for your life, and it involves marrying this person and taking this job and buying this house. And if you don't do those three specific things, you've missed out. That is not what calling is at all. Calling is bigger than that. Again, God created us in a certain time and place. He gives us certain natural gifts and abilities. We sometimes have the opportunity to cultivate those, we sometimes don't. And then all of those things kind of flow into the world as it is, that may or may not be a time and place where our gifts and talents are needed as much as in a previous time or some other time. But we still have a calling, and it's all about finding our particular fit in the world, so that someone can call us, and we can answer that call. And again, there's a fluidity to it that is far less rigid than God having a perfect plan for our life, or only having one shot and then we miss out. That's not biblical or true at all.
No, thank you for saying that. I think that's very helpful for me thinking through that as well, and I hope for other listeners who hear that as well, whether they're young or old. I know in my own life, I have an uncle who he was in his 40s probably at the time, and he's now pushing 70 at least. I can't remember exactly how old he is, but it wasn't until he was in his 40s that he felt the call to serve the Lord in a ministry where he ministered to children in the church through you you remember the royal ambassadors and the girls and the GAs.
The RAs
We're
and
talking about
GA.
the Southern Baptist Convention here for people who don't understand that language. But it was kind of a Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts in the Southern Baptist Convention discipleship model. But he felt a calling to serve uh, boys in that sense by serving as a leader in that, but also particularly through the cars that they would do, like the Pinewood Derby thing, and he would travel around and talk and speak and do that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, that was that was an example for me growing up that you know you can it's not too late to serve the Lord. No matter how old you are, you can answer that call. And he was in a perfect place in his life at that point to say yes to that calling because of where he was at in life, and his kids were older, and he could travel more and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's very helpful. You've talked about several times, the idea that our calling, like our time and place is very important to our calling, and that itself is a calling. Makes me think a little bit about the old country song. I think it was by Alan Jackson. It wasn't one of his biggest songs, but he talks about being born too late and how he feels like he's living in the wrong era and that sort of thing. And in some ways, I feel that way myself. So you talk about people who in medieval times knew their lot in life, whether they were peasant or royal, if they were wealthy or a tradesman, a craftsman. But you contrast that with people in modern times who may not ever know their calling. And you use that phrase, perhaps they would never know their calling or their lot in life. So we live in a time now where if you're born to a pastor, you're probably not going to be a pastor. If you're born to you could be, but you may not be. If you're born to a blacksmith, if those I don't think those exist anymore, but
They
you're not
do,
going
but not
right,
many.
not many, but you're not going to be a blacksmith, and so on. Can you talk about that a little bit more and how just that fluidity of modern times? I think in some ways, in my own mind, I think, well, if I knew I was born to a blacksmith and that's what I was going to be, it might be easier in life to discover your calling. Just talk about that a little bit more, and how can a person in 2025 go through their life exploring that and maybe coming to an understanding of what their calling is.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one of the big defining characteristics of modernity is simply that we have so many choices and have so many options. I mean, some more than others, but compared to pre-modern times, we have many, many more choices, almost unlimited choices and possibilities before us. And even if it's only a few, we still have to just make those decisions. So I think that, that the point that I'm trying to make about being a modern person is that it's harder to hear our calling, right? Because there are so many possibilities and so much buzz and noise and so many expectations and visions for what our good life might look like. But we also, I think, because of that, and again, this is partly why I wrote the book. We have an impoverished sense of what calling is. So we actually don't realize that if you get married, you are called to be a spouse to that person. That's one calling. If you have children, you are called to be a parent to those children. If you have children and therefore need to get a better job somehow, some way, then that becomes a calling. And again, so those are sort of like external. They're partly internal, but those are external responsibilities, obligations, duties, and so forth. So if we understand that those are all callings, then we can better, I think, discern what other callings we might have in our professional world, in our work world, because all of our callings need to work together. So it would not be right for a person to pursue a job or career or vocation that is going to harm the family or or do some harm in some other ways. And so we have to work all of our callings together, even as we try to discern that particular calling, which is the one that we usually mean when we're talking about the kind of work that we do, our professional life or our laboring life or so forth. And so people may not realize that we have this big glamorous idea about what calling is, and it could be right there in front of us, and we don't realize it's been there all along because we're looking for something else that is that thing. We all have not just a calling, we all have multiple callings. And so most of the time they're right there in front of us, but oftentimes they can develop or come later in life, as with the example of your uncle, or with just regular passing seasons of life where you some one phase does end and you have the opportunity to do something else, so a new calling can develop.
Oh, that is so good. Because I think sometimes, at least in my own experience, I feel like if I'm seeking God, I'm seeking His will for my life, am I going to miss it? And I think what you're saying in that is just as the Bible talks about the still small voice. Sometimes we have to be quiet enough to hear that voice of the Lord, and sometimes it may just be right in front of you, like you said. And so I think that is very, very, very helpful. Yeah, something to think through in regards to the many facets of calling, and not just seeking the one glamorous calling. Because we do live in a glam age, we live in the influencer age, we live in the YouTube star age, and people want the I know a decade or so ago, it was people wanting the, at least in the evangelical imagination, wanting the mega church pastor type calling, and now it's more in the this space, the podcast, YouTuber, influencer space. But sometimes that calling, and most of the time, that calling is just right in front of us, and it may not be as glamorous as we think it is. So yeah,
And it Yeah, and I mean, because we're inundated with so many images and examples and visions and distortions, that's why we do need to be discerning, because it's so easy to mistake someone else's calling for our own. Just because someone else is doing something and it looks interesting and desirable, that doesn't mean that that is your calling.
that is
But
so
we
good.
forget that. Mhm.
I think that is yes, I do. I know you're yeah, that's a word for me. And I know other people out there as well, but yeah, that's so helpful. And so good to think through and think about. And as you discern, is this for me? Is it not? Well, we talk about, you talk about the big calling that people think about in regards to work, and that our calling and vocation, which are pretty synonymous. Calling and vocation are synonymous words, or can be. You say that it may include work that helps us make a living, but it may not, and that's not necessarily the case for everyone. Why do you think that at least in our society, and particularly in an evangelical Christian subculture, that we equate calling and vocation with work, and particularly work that we make a living from? And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our calling.
That's a good question, and there's really a long history that I do cover briefly in the book, because the word vocation actually, back in the pre-Reformation days, was used. It was not just evangelicals who did this, but in before the Reformation, when the Catholic Church was all largely all that existed in Christian Europe, um, voc people who went into vocations were those who went into the church full
Mm.
time, right? History repeats itself. So that would have been, priests, nuns, monks, all of those were who had sacred callings, and the rest of the world had secular callings, and those two were very divided. I'm oversimplifying it, but one of the great revolutions of the Reformation and Martin Luther, and later the Counter Reformation, was the teaching that there's nothing secular, right? There's no sacred secular divide, and that a person who was doing work in the home or in the field or in the shop was fulfilling a God honoring vocation as much as someone who was doing work in the church. So the Reformation kind of tried to say to remove that artificial distinction, and yet it still kind of follows us through. And I think part of it is just simply the human reality. We all have to work somehow to provide a roof over our heads and food on the table. Even if we're doing that as a family working together, it's still work. And so we have to provide for ourselves. That's biblical. That's how God designed it. And so and for the most part, until something changes through, I don't know what kind of space age future we have in front of us, we have to work a good amount of time, right? Most of us we've inherited a great deal. We have to work, and there are those who have, but we have to work a lot, and so that is a big portion of our lives and our time. And so it is something serious to consider and to pursue. It is important. It does matter. I have a whole chapter on work because work is good. And so it just simply makes sense that we would think about vocation as the thing that we get paid to do, because for most human beings, there aren't many other options. Now, I do give one of my favorite examples in the book that I give is of a friend of mine who is a stay-at-home mom, has had 4 children, married to a pastor, and she has all her life loved the arts and theater and drama and dance. And so she just simply, in her role, in her calling as a mom, who sent her kids to, a Christian cooperative educational environment, she just simply volunteered to help the students put on plays and dramas, and she wrote some of those for them. And now she's done this for years, and she doesn't get paid for it, but it is something she understands now is a calling. She has performed in, written, produced, put on more plays than many people who have that as a profession have done. That is her calling. That is a vocation for her, even if that's not something she gets paid to do.
I thought that was a very, very helpful story because I think you're right. I think and it speaks to what you were talking about earlier about that was right under her nose and she didn't realize it until later. And that's kind of, maybe other people might sense that as well. And so I hope that that story is helpful for others who may feel that way.
And can I paint a contrasting picture while I'm doing that story? So that on the other hand, there may be people who, they've got to provide for themselves and their families, and they don't care much how they do it, so they get the best job they can to bring in as much money and health insurance as they can, and they're not passionate about it. They do their job, they do it well. They come home and they spend all the time outside of home pursuing some hobby or passion or spending time with family, and in a sense, that's what they live for, is the time outside the job, and that's perfectly fine, right? I mean, there are people, this happens in ministry a lot. People who are what we call bivocational ministers, and they have a job, they do it well, they are faithful employees, but they also have something else outside it that is the thing that they really care about, that they really feel called to. Whereas the job, they could switch it up, they'll take the next one that comes along for the better benefits, because that job isn't a calling. It's just a way of fulfilling their real callings, which are to their family, to their ministry, to that passion that they have. So that's another way of looking at it. your job doesn't have to be your calling. It might be something you do because that you have to provide for ourselves.
I love in the book that you talk about in one of the chapters that you became, and maybe it wasn't just one time, but you give a specific example that you became an unintentional dream squasher as you look back over your tenure as a professor. And you gave one example of a lady named Sarah Sanderson who you dream squashed her writing aspirations, but then she kind of had a "I told you so" moment where she gave you a manuscript and you had to say, "Yes, you're right, I was wrong." But in a society that's filled, as we talked about earlier, with influencers and social media stars and megachurch pastors, how can having a more realistic idea of calling and more realistic dreams about our future and what may the Lord may be calling us to do help us as we explore our calling?
Yeah, no, that's such an important topic, and I was and am a dream squasher for a long, long time. It wasn't just that one time, but I think it's simply because we really have to know reality. I mean, that's another way of saying being realistic, but that phrase kind of loses its power because often people think it just means, not dreaming. That's not what I mean at all. We can dream, but we still have to face reality as it is. As Christians, we must do that. We must know the world, know the times that we are in, know how God made us and what's happening in our world. And so and also to know the field. No, I mean, of course my field now is writing, and I encounter so many writers who have so many wrong-headed dreams because they really haven't done the research. If you just do the simple research about how many books are published a year, what the average sales is, what the average, it's abysmal. No, very now, of course, there are the few who go on to become New York Times bestsellers. Even that doesn't, really accomplish much, or, become full-time writers, as I've slowly eased into over a number of years. But I still have to depend on my school teacher husband's salary and health insurance. It's still not that great. But we have to know reality and accept it. And then I think we can actually do a better job of leaning into our calling, finding our calling and our vocation. And so it's not so much about squashing dreams as it is to be realistic and to therefore not be so disappointed and so despairing when something that was never going to happen doesn't happen. And so if we know the world and could find our place in it, there's so much joy to be had in that, so much fulfillment and contentment and even fulfilling of our purpose when we know this world and we live in this world that God has placed us in. And simply being ignorant of the realities of wherever we are and whatever we're pursuing is not being a good steward, and it's just likely to set us up for great disappointment. Whereas if something amazing and unexpected does happen in pursuit of our sort of modest hopes, then all the better. It's a matter of not expecting and being willing to be surprised and delighted, not just in the big things, but in all the ordinary things around us.
I think that is so well put, and I think you're right. I think we have to be realistic, and so I think sometimes the listening to the wisdom of older, wiser people can be helpful. But in some cases, like Sarah, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you, Doctor Pryor. Yeah.
She
So,
did.
and she did, and so yeah, I think that's good.
And, I mean, some of this is youthful idealism, as you said, and I mentioned that in the book, so we can't discount that. But some of it is also bad teaching and unrealistic expectations being set by others. And that can be done with good intentions, but I also just want to say it can also be done and often is done by people who are trying to sell something, whether it's a certain kind of education or a certain kind of program or the influencers, or they're trying to justify their own lives, or they're really misunderstanding who God is and how he works because they are putting so much on human effort, saying that it's up to us to do big things for God, or it's up to us to sort of seize control, to take the wheel, to use the country. I know that country song. I don't know if it's a country song or
Jesus,
not, but
take the wheel.
yeah, yeah. we are taught badly in many ways by our culture, by our society, by our social imaginary, to invoke my last book. And so, yes, we have youthful idealism, but also we just have so many distortions in the modern age where there's so many visions and salesmen and grifters and people trying to sell their own vision or justify their own mistaken path through life.
Well, I love in the book you talk about the transcendentals. And I myself, I grew up Southern Baptist, but I am actually currently no longer in the Southern Baptist Convention. I am, for various reasons, in the Anglican tradition now. I've talked about that in previous podcasts. And coming across, so the Transcendentals, and that's part of the ministry of Reading for the Glory now. We say, what we've changed our vision for this ministry, that we want to discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word. And it was coming into the Anglican tradition that I really became exposed to the idea of truth, goodness, and beauty. Growing up in the Baptist tradition, which I love, it was all about truth. It was all about seeking truth, knowing the truth, living the truth, preaching the truth, teaching the truth. But it really didn't teach me a lot about goodness and beauty. And I've experienced that in my new tradition of leaning into and pursuing God in not only the truth, but in that which is good and that which is beautiful. How is it pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty different from the typical evangelical understanding of pursuing our calling?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different from any treatment of pursuing calling that I've encountered. And I think, lest I scare any listeners away, I really do try to introduce the transcendentals in a very user friendly way, especially for those for whom those ideas might be new. I mean, most of us have heard the phrase before. We may not know how to define truth, goodness, and beauty, and I draw on some good sources to do that. But um, I I think that I mean I'm accustomed to talking about truth, goodness, and beauty in the context of art and literature and in the classical tradition. And if it's good enough for some of those things, it's certainly good enough for evangelicals or Christians who are trying to find their way in life. And the whole idea of the transcendentals is that they reflect God's nature, they reflect his character, they have their source in him, and they lead us to him. So if they do that in any way, then of course, by pursuing those in the area of our vocation, we will in we are much more likely to find and hear the calling that God has for us. And oftentimes, as I said, it can be that one that's right in front of us, but we were looking for something else. We were looking for the big Instagram account, or we were looking for, the trip overseas, or the call from whatever parachurch ministry. When instead, if we see the truth, goodness, and beauty that's all around us, that we are participating in and cultivating, or could participate in and cultivate, then we are closer to finding our calling.
That is very well said. I love, when thinking about the transcendentals, all truth is God's truth, all goodness is God's goodness, all beauty is God's beauty. And for something to be true, it has to be good and beautiful. And for something to be good, it has to be beautiful and good. And for something to be beautiful, it has to be true and good. I think that is so helpful, especially thinking about calling, because there's truth out there to be had that's not just in the revealed truth of God's word. And I think that shows the necessity and the design of God to um, allow us to explore his world in a way that's not just through his word, which is crucially important to the Christian life. But we can also know God through nature. And I think that shows the importance of science and exploring God's world and exploring truths through science, and discovering things about the human body and about the medical field and about the animal kingdom and so many things that even, you talk about space, exploring space, we can discover God's truth in a myriad of ways, and we can lean into our calling in that way. But also through goodness and beauty. And so people can explore beauty and goodness and not merely the truth, because if you're seeking beauty, you're going to arrive at the truth and goodness. So yeah, I thought that was very, very helpful. And that is something that my family is trying to lean into more now, being a part of the Anglican tradition. And so yeah, I was very encouraged when I read your book that you had that in there, and was very excited, and encouraged as I was reading through. So yeah.
Well, that was my really experimental part of the book. It's really almost half of the book is talking about truth, goodness, and beauty. And so I didn't know really how it would be taken. You're one of the first podcasters to interview me about the book. And so it's really encouraging and exciting to know that it spoke to you, because in a lot of ways, you're sort of my target audience, right? It's not just college students, but Christians who are searching and wanting to, fulfill God's call on their lives, especially in a world where so many confusing and often wrong messages are sent to us. So it means a lot that the book spoke to you, and in particularly that part, which was is really the unique thing I think I bring to this important topic on calling.
Well, thank you. I hope that other people that interview you about your book lean into that as well. I hope that hits, especially since it's half the book. Um, but yeah, I think that that's something that Christians in the past, I think, at least in the modern evangelical world, we don't necessarily lean into those as much. Like I was saying earlier, we lean more into the truth. I think maybe in generations past they leaned into that a little bit more, than we do now, and especially through art. A lot of Christian art has very much, there's a license for the beauty, right? But we still like the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. We see that as very much an art for its time, but it also transcends, right? Its time. And so we can appreciate the beauty and what it tells us about who God is, and tells us about who we are, by enjoying that beautiful art. Or a good book, which is what we want to point people to here on this podcast. But even just enjoying nature as well, getting out there and exploring God's world through nature, and enjoying His beauty. And I think that's one of the things for me in a world that we live mostly inside. I think, as you uh, tweet about a lot, you're running. You get out there and you explore God's beauty through nature, and you're running. And I think we can lean into that more in our own modern world of getting out and exploring uh, nature. Well, what advice would you give to particularly a young person who would pick up your book, or maybe listening to this conversation today, about their calling, and vocational path that they are pursuing? I know that's probably a big question, loaded question, and in a sense, we've talked about that the whole time. But what one piece of advice would you give regarding calling to someone who's young?
Well, again, I would repeat that calling comes from outside. We have our own inner desires and passions, but that does not make the calling that comes from outside. And so, really, life is sort of a quest to bring those things together, and it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. Young people, you have to learn. We learn. More about our passions and desires and our skills and interests, and those can change and grow and develop over time. And so, when we're talking about calling, we should be listening to the things that other people in our lives say to us. Not that they're always true, but listening for the call, listening to be asked to do something, to be asked to serve in some way that you uniquely can. And that's the open door to finding our calling.
Very, very helpful. Well, as we wrap up, just a couple more questions. What would you say to someone who? So that was the previous question, was someone who was younger, someone who's a little bit older in life, a little more mature, who maybe at one point in life when they were young, they felt like they had a certain calling, but for various reasons, they find themselves in a totally different place in life than they thought they would be, and maybe they've given up on the idea of calling. What would you say to someone in that? Uh, in that space about calling and pursuing what the Lord is leading them to do.
I think many people are in that space or they will be, and I think it again to start with the idea that there are multiple callings over life. Sometimes those callings end, sometimes they shift, sometimes they take a different form. And so we need to be honest and say, perhaps this calling has ended. Or perhaps this I have the same calling, but I need to find a new way to embody it and pursue it. And to be open to all of those possibilities, and especially be open to the possibility of a new calling that that you can bring all of your old skills and experiences and and talents into.
Well, I think that is very good advice, and I hope that people who are listening who are in either of those places in life will experience some encouragement there as they think about their own calling. Well, one last question I have before we go, and I always try to end with this question, especially to our guests who are authors, and particularly since now writing is your primary calling. What future writing projects are you working on, and do you have any other books planned after this one?
Yeah, well, I do have another book in mind, but it's too early for me to talk about it. It's just there in my mind. So this one will, this is, yeah, just this one's just launching, and we'll get that one out. But the main project that I'm working on has been ongoing, and that is my Substack newsletter, The Priory, where we're reading good literature together. I write about other things, but primarily that's what we do is read poetry and literature together, and try to appreciate the good, true, and beautiful from literary masterpieces.
Well, yeah, I think that's good, and we'll be sure to put a link to your Substack so people can find that. And that reminds me of, are you familiar with the ministry of Malcolm Guite?
Yes,
Yeah, he does something very similar on his YouTube channel where he reads literature and maybe discusses a little bit. It helps he has a very British accent and he has a very wealth of knowledge too. Coming, he's an older gentleman who's an Anglican, so there you go. He's leaning into that. But yeah, I love his he does that as well.
he's a treasure. He's a
Very
gift to the church.
amen. I've tried to get him on the podcast, and he is working on his Arthurian legends epic poem, and so I was. He said he didn't have time. Maybe in the future we'll get him on. I'd love to have him on as well. Well, thank you, Karen, for being on the podcast again today. It was such a great conversation, such a great topic. So very glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'd
Always
love.
a blessing.
Amen. We'd love to have you back on as maybe one day if when you have a new book out. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Like I said, we'll be sure to have a link to your Substack and also a link to your new book. You Have a Calling, so that people can find a way to get that. We'll put that in our show notes today. For our listeners, if you have a comment or a question, or you would simply like to just drop us a note, you can do that in the comment section below. Or you can do that if you want to do that, I would say the old school way, by email. You can drop us a note at readingfortheglory.com/contact. You can check us out on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads, and we're also on YouTube. Be sure to check out our website to stay up to date on our latest articles, book reviews, and the podcast episodes. We would encourage you to subscribe, and wherever you're listening to this podcast, be very helpful for us. And if you would like more information about how to support the ongoing ministry of Reading for the Glory, you can do that at the support the show link in show notes, or you can go to readingfortheglory.com/free gift, where we have an ongoing offer for anyone who can be a monthly donor. We'd love to send you a free book as a thank you for that. Well, we'd like to thank you again for listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast, and we hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to having you join us again next time as we discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word.